My mother tore my wedding portrait in half in front of 200 guests. Not a copy. Not some decoration the venue had printed for the reception. The portrait Daniel and I had chosen for the entrance, the one where I was laughing instead of checking my phone, fixing someone's schedule, or making sure my younger sister Sophie had everything she needed. Mom ripped straight through my face. Then she dropped both halves at my feet. Your sister needs your eyes more than you need this marriage. For a second, the ballroom went so quiet I could hear the torn edge of the photograph sliding across the hardwood. My father pointed toward the doors. Choose Sophie, Leah, or leave this family. I was 39 years old. I was a senior project scheduler for one of the largest infrastructure contractors in Seattle. My entire career was built around catching problems before they became emergencies. But standing there in my wedding dress, surrounded by relatives, coworkers, Daniel's family, and people who had known me since childhood, I almost did what I had done for 9 years. I almost apologized. Then I looked at Sophie. She sat beside my parents, one hand curled around the edge of the table. At 34, her eyesight had deteriorated enough that she no longer drove and sometimes needed help navigating unfamiliar places. Her condition was real. Her fear was real. And she was smiling. Not happily. It was smaller than that. Tighter. The expression of someone who believed an argument was finally over because the person who always gave in had been cornered where everyone could see her. I bent down and picked up the 2 halves of my wedding portrait. My hands were shaking. My voice wasn't. I need 5 minutes. Mom reached for my arm. I stepped back before she could touch me. Leah, she warned. I turned away. Daniel moved toward me, but I shook my head once. Not because I didn't want him, because for once, I needed the next thing that happened to belong entirely to me. I walked out of my own reception, crossed the carpeted hallway outside the ballroom, and pulled my phone from the hidden pocket sewn into my dress. Then I made one call. Not to the police. Not to a lawyer. Not even to my new husband. I called the clinic handling my evaluation. When the coordinator answered, I gave my full name and date of birth. Then I said, from this moment forward, nobody speaks for me. Nobody confirms anything for me, and nobody tells my family I agreed to any procedure unless those words come directly from my mouth. There was a pause. Not the kind of pause that comes before bad news. The kind that comes when someone is checking the screen in front of them. Miss Morgan, she said carefully, I can note your communication preference, but I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. My mother keeps telling everyone the doctors are waiting on me. Another pause. I stared through the narrow glass panel in the ballroom doors. My mother was still standing beside the torn display easel. My father had his arms folded. Sophie had stopped smiling. The coordinator said, no procedure has been scheduled for you. I tightened my grip on the phone. What? You're still in the evaluation and information stage. There are additional steps before any decision could even be considered. I looked back at my mother. That's not what I was told. I can only discuss your portion of the process, she said. But nothing in your file indicates that you've committed to a procedure. That was the first crack. It would take me weeks to understand what my parents were actually afraid of losing. And it wasn't Sophie's eyesight. 3 months earlier, none of this had sounded like an ultimatum. It had sounded like one more thing I could help with. That distinction mattered, although I didn't understand how much at the time. Sophie's eyesight had been getting worse for years. Some months were relatively stable. Others came with new tests, changed prescriptions, specialist referrals, or another adjustment to a life that had gradually become smaller. She had stopped driving at 31. By 33, unfamiliar buildings made her anxious because changes in lighting and contrast could make navigation difficult. My parents handled some things. I handled everything else. When Mom called me that March, she asked if Daniel and I could come over Sunday afternoon. Her voice had that careful softness she used when she already knew what she wanted before she asked. Is Sophie okay? I said. She's fine right now. Right now. 2 words capable of destroying an entire weekend. Daniel looked over from the kitchen island as I ended the call. What happened? They want us over Sunday. About Sophie? I nodded. He waited. That was one of the first things I had loved about Daniel. He didn't fill silence just because it made him uncomfortable. I'll move the florist appointment, I said. He frowned. We have to. It's Sophie. That had been enough explanation for most of my adult life. Sunday afternoon, we sat around my parents' dining table while Sophie twisted a napkin between her fingers. Mom did most of the talking. There may be another option, she said. That was the phrase. Another option. Not a surgery scheduled for next week. Not a doctor, saying Sophie would lose all remaining vision by Tuesday unless I intervened. An option. There was a research-based treatment pathway being discussed, and because of the specifics of Sophie's condition, relatives might be evaluated for whether certain forms of tissue or cell donation could potentially become relevant. The medicine was more complicated than Mom made it sound. That should have been my first warning. Evelyn Morgan hated complexity, whenever complexity interfered with a moral conclusion she had already reached. She pushed a folder toward me. I told them you'd be willing to be tested. I looked at her. You told them? Leah. She gave me that patient smile. Obviously, you'd want to know whether you could help your sister. Daniel's hand rested on his knee under the table. He didn't touch me. He knew I hated being calmed down when I wasn't angry yet. I'm willing to hear what they say, I said. Mom looked at Sophie. There. See? Sophie exhaled. Dad reached across the table and squeezed my shoulder. That's my girl. I should have corrected them then. I should have said, hearing information is not consent. Instead, I opened the folder. That was how most things started in my family. Not with an order. With something small enough to feel cruel to refuse. By the time the clinic contacted me directly, Mom had already begun using a different vocabulary. The evaluation became the donation. Possibility became plan. Consideration became promise. One evening, Sophie called while I was reviewing a construction schedule from my sofa. You're still doing it, right? I muted the television. Doing what? The testing. Yes. I said I'd complete the initial evaluation. She was quiet. Mom said you told her you'd do whatever I needed if you were eligible. I closed my laptop halfway. I said I'd get information. Another silence. Then Sophie laughed nervously. Same difference. No, I said. It isn't. She went quiet again. I could hear traffic behind her. Mom must have been driving. Then Sophie said, I knew you wouldn't leave me hanging. I remember staring at the spreadsheet glowing on my screen. That sentence should have bothered me more than it did. Instead, I felt relieved. Useful. Necessary. Loved. In the particular language my family had taught me to recognize as love. At work, I knew better than to build anything that way. 2 weeks before the wedding, I was in a planning meeting for a highway interchange project when one of our subcontractors told us a critical crane operation might slip 6 days. Why? I asked. Their superintendent shifted in his chair. Our main operator's wife is having surgery. And the backup? He glanced at the project manager. We don't really have one. I looked at the schedule projected across the conference room wall. 43 tasks downstream depended on that lift. You have a 43-task chain hanging on one person? Nobody answered. I capped my pen. If one person is the whole contingency plan, you don't have a plan. There were a few uncomfortable smiles around the table. I spent the next hour helping them restructure the sequence. That afternoon, my director, Mara Chen, stopped beside my desk. You still thinking about Denver? I leaned back. Mara had offered me a promotion 3 weeks earlier. Senior regional scheduling lead, larger projects, a stronger team, and the kind of responsibility I had spent years working toward. Daniel could transfer fairly easily. His firm had an office there. 5 years earlier, I would have accepted before Mara finished the sentence. Instead, I had told her I needed time. I'm getting married in 2 weeks, I said. That is not an answer to my question. I smiled. Mara rarely wasted words. My sister's dealing with some medical issues. I know. I may need to stay close for a while. She studied me for a second. Need to? I looked at her. She nodded toward the schedule on my monitor. You're very good at identifying assumptions when they're written on a project plan, Leah. Then she walked away. I remember being annoyed with her, mostly because I understood exactly what she meant. The Denver offer would remain open until 3 weeks after the wedding. I told myself I would decide when things were calmer. Calmer was another word I had misused for years. In my family, calmer usually meant after I had agreed. The morning after my wedding, I woke at 6. 12 inches, a hotel suite overlooking downtown Seattle. For about 5 seconds, I forgot everything. Then I saw the garment bag hanging by the window. Daniel's suit jacket was draped over a chair, and the two halves of my wedding portrait were lying face down on the desk. I had carried them out of the ballroom myself. I didn't know why. Maybe because leaving them on the floor would have felt like agreeing with what my mother had done to them. My phone had 63 notifications. Daniel was asleep beside me. I slipped out of bed and took the phone into the sitting area. The family group chat had started before midnight. Aunt Carol wrote, "Your mother is devastated. Please don't let one argument destroy your family. Dad, when you're ready to be reasonable, call us. Mom, I hope when the excitement of the wedding wears off, you remember that Sophie doesn't get to walk away from what is happening to her." Then, 20 minutes later, "You do." I stared at that one for a while. Another aunt wrote, "Marriage shouldn't change who you are." A cousin sent a heart emoji and, "Family comes first." Nobody asked whether I was okay. Nobody mentioned that my mother had torn my wedding portrait in front of 200 people. Nobody asked why a medical decision involving my body had become entertainment between the cake cutting and the first dance. I opened Sophie's private message. "You promised." Just 2 words. I started typing. "I never promised you, my." I deleted it. Typed again. "Mom has been telling you things I didn't." Deleted that too. I had spent years answering every emotional accusation immediately, as if speed could prevent people from deciding who I was. Instead, I opened my laptop. Daniel appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, barefoot, hair flattened on one side. "What are you doing?" "Making a folder." He looked at the screen. The folder name read, "Sophie, what I actually agreed to." Daniel poured himself water. "Of course you are." I looked up. Was that judgment? No. He sat across from me. "That was me realizing you respond to family trauma with file architecture." Despite everything, I laughed. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then I opened my email. I searched Sophie's name. Clinic. Evaluation. Mom. Appointments. I wasn't looking for ammunition. At least, I didn't think I was. I wanted one simple thing. A date. Mom had said there was no time. Dad had said Sophie could not wait for me to finish playing bride. Carol had texted that some decisions could not be postponed. So where was the deadline? I found messages about consultations, forms, preliminary testing, follow-up discussions. Nothing saying, "Leah must decide by this date." Nothing saying, "A procedure is scheduled." Nothing saying, "Sophie's treatment cannot proceed unless Leah does X immediately." There were a lot of words. Very few dates. In scheduling, that usually meant one of 2 things. Either the plan wasn't mature enough yet, or someone was selling urgency they couldn't support. Daniel watched me scroll. "What exactly did you agree to?" he asked. I stopped. I had expected comfort. That question felt almost hostile. I agreed to be evaluated. And? To listen to the options. And? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Daniel leaned back. "That's all I'm asking." I looked at the torn portrait across the room. "My family thinks I agreed to more." "Did you?" "No." It was the first time I had said it that plainly. No, I hadn't. That morning, I called the clinic again. I asked the coordinator to clarify the status of my participation. She was careful, professional. She repeated that she could discuss my evaluation but not disclose Sophie's private medical information. I told her I understood. Then she walked me through my side of the process. There were still informational steps, potential screening requirements, additional discussions, and, critically, no scheduled procedure involving me. "No deadline?" I asked. "Not one attached to a commitment from you." I stared out the hotel window. Seattle was gray and wet below us, traffic moving slowly along the avenue. "My mother keeps telling people the doctors are waiting for me." The coordinator paused. "I can't speak to what someone else told your family." "I know, but your consent would need to be voluntary and specific." Voluntary, specific. 2 words my family had managed to replace with obvious. Of course Leah would. Obviously, Leah could. Naturally, Leah should. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat very still. Daniel came over but didn't touch me until I reached for his hand first. What did she say? There's no procedure scheduled. His fingers tightened around mine. So your mother lied. I shook my head automatically. I don't know yet. That mattered. Mom might have misunderstood something. She might have panicked. She might have heard time sensitive and translated it into tomorrow. I wasn't ready to make her worse than the facts allowed. But I was finally ready to make the facts matter more than her version. I went back through my messages. One from Dad, sent 6 days before the wedding, caught my attention. I had told him Daniel and I were still considering Denver. Dad had answered, "If you leave right after the wedding, what are we supposed to do about Sophie?" Not, "What is Sophie supposed to do? What are we supposed to do?" I read it twice, then a third time. At work, when a schedule failed, I looked for the critical path, the sequence of tasks that determined whether everything else moved or stopped. For 9 years, every family problem involving Sophie seemed to have the same critical path: me. I had never asked whether that was because I was the only person capable of helping, or because everyone else had quietly organized their lives around the assumption that I would. My phone rang. Mom. I let it ring. That was new enough that my heart started pounding. A voicemail appeared. Then a text. "Call me before you make this worse." A minute later. Sophie has enough to deal with without wondering whether her own sister is abandoning her. I locked the screen. Daniel watched me. "You okay?" No. It felt surprisingly good to tell the truth. Then I opened my work email. Mara's message from before the wedding was still there. Denver Regional Scheduling Lead Transfer Packet. I had never opened the attachment. My cursor hovered over it. For 9 years, whenever Sophie's condition changed, my life adjusted around it. A trip disappeared. A conference moved. A weekend vanished. An opportunity waited. I had always told myself I was making temporary accommodations, but temporary things were supposed to end. Instead, I had become what I warned project teams against: a single point of failure. The person everyone assumed would always be there, because I always had been. I clicked Mara's number. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Chen, it's Leah. Please tell me you are not calling me about work the morning after your wedding. Technically, it's afternoon. It is 9:43. I glanced at the clock. She was right. For the first time that morning, I smiled. Then I looked at the 2 halves of my wedding portrait. "If Denver is still open," I said, "keep my name on it." Mara's tone changed. "Are you asking me to hold the offer?" I thought about Mom's hand tearing through the photograph. Dad, pointing at the door. Sophie, saying I had promised. The coordinator saying no procedure had been scheduled. And my father asking what they were supposed to do if I left. "No," I said. I pulled the laptop closer. "I'm asking you to send me the transfer packet." The transfer packet landed in my inbox 11 minutes later. For a while, I just stared at the subject line: Denver Regional Scheduling Lead Formal Offer. Daniel had gone downstairs for coffee, giving me the room without making a ceremony out of it. The hotel suite still looked like the morning after a wedding: champagne glasses on a side table, my shoes under a chair, a bouquet already starting to sag in its vase. The 2 halves of the portrait remained on the desk. Opening the offer felt more irreversible than calling Mara had. The salary increase was substantial. The role came with a larger team, more authority, and projects I had been asking to lead for years. The proposed start date was 8 weeks away. Relocation assistance was included. There was enough time to find an apartment, enough time for Daniel to transfer offices, enough time to hand over my current projects properly. On paper, it was almost embarrassingly manageable. My eyes kept returning to one line: acceptance requested within 10 business days. There it was. A real deadline. A date attached to an actual decision. No one had to tell me, before it's too late. No one had to make me guess what catastrophe would happen if I waited. A plan with no date was usually just someone else's urgency wearing a costume. That morning, the difference felt enormous. By Monday, I was back at work. Mara called me into her office just before lunch. She had a glass wall, an overloaded whiteboard, and a habit of arranging pens parallel to the edge of her desk when she was thinking. "You opened it," she said. "Twice." "And?" "My sister's situation is complicated." Mara waited. There were very few people in my life who could leave a pause alone. "My parents think I need to stay nearby," I added. "Do you?" The question irritated me instantly. Not because it was unfair, because it was precise. "I don't know yet." "Then figure out what need means before you give away the job." My mouth tightened. "That sounds very simple when you say it." "It probably isn't." She slid a printed transition schedule across the desk. "I can give you the 10 business days in the offer. I can't hold the position indefinitely." "That's fair." "And Leah?" I looked up. "Don't make a permanent career decision based on a temporary emergency, unless you've confirmed the emergency." For half a second, I wondered how much my face had given away. Mara didn't ask what happened at the wedding. She didn't need the story. She had given me exactly what an ally should have given me. A real opportunity. A real deadline. The choice was mine. Back at my desk, 2 columns appeared in my notebook, almost without conscious thought. What Sophie medically needs. What everyone is used to me doing. The first column had only 3 items, because those were the only ones I could honestly verify. Transportation to some appointments. Help with unfamiliar buildings when accessibility was poor. Backup support after certain procedures or tests, depending on what her providers recommended. The second column filled half the page. Scheduling. Rescheduling. Driving. Parking. Picking up prescriptions. Calling insurance. Keeping track of referral authorizations. Reminding Sophie when paperwork was due. Calling Mom to explain what Sophie had already explained. Calling Sophie to explain what Mom claimed the clinic had said. Looking up hotels when specialists were outside Seattle. Moving meetings. Using vacation days. Buying lunch because appointments ran long. Sitting in waiting rooms. Being available. That last one bothered me most. Being available wasn't a task. It was a condition of employment. And sometime over the previous 9 years, my relatives had turned it into mine. The first time had seemed harmless. Sophie was 25. I was 30. Her vision had begun changing faster that year, and Mom called me late on a Tuesday evening. "Your father has something at work tomorrow," she said. "I need you to take Sophie to the specialist." At the time, Dad had been doing part-time consulting after retiring from his full-time job. I had a project review at 9 the next morning. "What time is the appointment?" 10:15. "Mom, I have a review." "It's one meeting." "It's a client review." A little pause followed. Then her voice softened. "You're the one she's comfortable with." There had been something flattering in that. Not the request itself. The role. The dependable daughter. The capable one. The person whose presence made difficult things easier. Daniel wasn't in my life yet. My apartment was 10 minutes from the office. I had enough PTO banked that taking a day did not hurt immediately. So I rearranged the review. One day became another a few weeks later. Then a follow-up. Then an imaging appointment. Mom began keeping me copied on Sophie's schedule. Eventually, she stopped asking if I could take her. She simply asked which time worked better. Tuesday at 11 or Thursday at 2. Choice, presented inside an assumption. Back then, I mistook being necessary for having a secure place in the family. Mom used to introduce me to people by saying, "Leah is my capable girl. She handles everything." The first few times, I glowed. Years later, the compliment had started to sound like an invoice. 3 memories came back to me while I sat at my desk that afternoon. The first was a professional conference in Portland 4 years earlier. My company had paid for registration. I was scheduled to sit on a panel about infrastructure sequencing, the first panel invitation I had ever received. The night before I was supposed to leave, Sophie called. Her appointment had been moved because of a cancellation. "Mom says tomorrow is the only opening for 3 months. Can Dad take you? He hates driving downtown." That was the answer. Not he couldn't. He hated it. The next morning, instead of boarding a train to Portland, I drove Sophie through rain to the medical center. No one in the family remembered the panel. 2 months later, Sophie showed up at Mom's birthday dinner with a lemon cake from a bakery Evelyn liked. Mom took 3 photographs of it. "Look at my thoughtful girl," she said. I had spent the previous Saturday sorting through insurance correspondence because one of Sophie's referrals had been coded incorrectly. Nobody knew that happened. At the time, it had not even occurred to me to mention it. The second memory involved money. Parking fees, gas, meals, co-pays. Sophie sometimes asked me to put on my card because hers was close to its limit. A hotel near a specialist south of Portland. Prescription pickups Mom promised to reimburse after she found her checkbook. Keep track, she would say. I almost never did. You make more than Sophie, Dad once told me when I asked whether someone could reimburse a larger travel expense. There was no accusation in his tone. That made it harder to argue with. You're better with money. Another compliment that functioned like an assignment. The third memory was the one I had worked hardest not to connect to Sophie. 5 years before Denver, another office had offered me a smaller transfer opportunity. Not a promotion, but a strong move. Portland. Sophie had just entered a rough stretch with her eyesight. Mom cried when I mentioned the offer. She never said, "You are not allowed to go." She said something much more effective. "I don't know what we'd do without you right now." So I stayed. The offer expired. 3 months later, Sophie stabilized. Nobody brought Portland up again. That evening, the old calendars came out. Not because I planned to confront anyone with numbers. The transfer required a transition plan, and if I was going to leave Seattle without hurting Sophie, I needed to understand what I had actually been doing. Daniel found me on the living room floor with my laptop open, my work calendars pulled up, and a legal pad full of dates. "You're auditing your own life," he said. "I'm estimating workload. That sounds healthier." "It isn't." He sat on the couch. A few hours later, the numbers had become difficult to dismiss. Over 9 years, I could document more than 170 trips connected to appointments, tests, pharmacy runs, consultations, or related errands. Some were short. Some took most of a day. At least 32 full days of paid leave had gone directly to Sophie-related responsibilities. The expenses were harder to reconstruct because I had been careless about reimbursement. I used credit card statements, email receipts, parking apps, and hotel confirmations. The total crossed $17,000 before I stopped. Daniel leaned forward. "That's not including food or all the smaller stuff." "No." "Or the hours you worked late because you missed half a day." "No." "Or Portland." My pen stopped. "No." He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did I. What unsettled me was not that the amount was enormous. It was that no one had hidden it from me. No one had secretly stolen $17,000. I had paid it. No one had forged 32 leave requests. I had submitted them. The system had worked because I kept volunteering just quickly enough that nobody had to ask whether it should exist. Daniel broke the quiet. "Did anyone know the total?" A strange laugh escaped me. I didn't know the total. That hurt more than I expected. By Wednesday, Mom had called 7 times. I answered the 8th. "Finally," she said. "Hi, Mom. We need to sit down." "I agree." That threw her off for half a beat. "Good. Come over tomorrow. 6:30. Your father and Sophie will be here." "Good. Daniel doesn't need to come." The phrasing registered. Not shouldn't. Doesn't need to. "He won't," I said. This conversation was mine. Thursday evening, Dad was already at the dining table when I arrived. Sophie sat beside him, phone enlarged to a high-contrast display. Mom had a yellow legal pad in front of her, which made me almost smile. Apparently, we were all bringing office supplies now. She opened with the same sentence she had been repeating since the wedding. "Sophie cannot put her life on hold while you decide what matters." My purse went on the chair beside me. "I'm not asking Sophie to put anything on hold. You're talking about moving to Denver. I'm considering accepting a promotion." Dad exhaled through his nose. "Same thing." "No, it isn't." Mom pressed 2 fingers against her temple. "Fine. Then delay it." "For how long?" 6 months. There it was. I looked down at my notebook. "What changes in 6 months?" Her eyebrows lifted. "What do you mean? What treatment milestone happens in 6 months?" "This isn't a construction schedule, Leah." "I know." "Then stop talking like it is." Sophie shifted in her chair. "Mom just means we need time." "How much time do you need from me each week?" The room changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Dad looked at Mom. Mom looked back at me. What kind of question is that? A practical one. Your sister's eyesight isn't a spreadsheet. No, my time is. Sophie flinched. Regret hit immediately. Not because the sentence was untrue, because she could reasonably hear it as me reducing her illness to hours. I turned toward her. That came out wrong. Your condition isn't a schedule, but the work everyone expects me to do has one. She nodded once, but her mouth stayed tight. Mom seized the opening. This is exactly what I mean. You've become so transactional. My notebook remained closed. How many appointments does Sophie have in an average month? You know how often she goes. Then tell me. Mom's jaw tightened. It varies. Which appointments actually require someone to drive her? She can't drive. I know. That isn't what I asked. Dad leaned forward. What is the point of this? The point is that you want me to delay a major move for 6 months. I need to know what I'm delaying it to do. Help your sister. With what? Mom stared at me. For most of my life, that question would have sounded insulting. That night, it sounded overdue. Transportation, she said. Appointments. Insurance. Things she needs. Which things are you doing? Her face changed. Only slightly. Enough for me to notice. I manage plenty. I'm asking because if I leave, we need a handoff. Stop calling it that. What would you call it? Family. The word sat between us. Dad shook his head. Why are you turning Sophie into a project? My pen moved before I answered. What I'm trying to avoid is treating one person as the entire plan. Nobody spoke. The crane operator came back to me. 43 downstream tasks. One person. No backup. At work, everyone would have agreed that was irresponsible. At my parents' table, they called it love. A few possibilities came out slowly. Dad could take some appointments. We'd have to see, he said. Downtown traffic isn't easy for me anymore. There were transportation services. Mom's answer came before I had named one. I am not putting Sophie in a car with strangers. I haven't suggested a company yet. I know what those services are like. Which ones have you tried? None, because she has family. The sentence went into my notebook. Not theatrically. Just because it mattered. Maybe Aunt Carol could cover an occasional Saturday. Carol has grandchildren. Paid assistance could fill certain gaps if needed. Mom's expression hardened. We are not paying outsiders to do something her own sister should want to do. That one went into the notebook, too. Sophie had been quiet for several minutes. What about me? She asked. Mom turned. What do you mean? There are things I can probably do myself. You already have enough to deal with. The speed of Mom's answer caught my attention. So did Sophie's face. She looked down at her enlarged screen. Nothing else was resolved that evening. That was almost more useful than resolution. Mom wanted 6 months. Dad wanted me to stop asking how the 6 months would be used. Every alternative carried a flaw too large to tolerate, except me giving up Denver. At the door, Mom lowered her voice. You're making this harder than it has to be. Maybe. Or maybe making something visible always feels like making it harder when everyone benefited from not looking. I'll give you an answer after I understand what's actually needed. Her lips thinned. You already know what's needed. No, I said. I know what I've always done. The distinction followed me all the way home. Sophie texted just after 10. Why are you acting like this is new? I sat at the kitchen counter while Daniel loaded the dishwasher. My reply took longer than it should have. Because no one has ever asked whether the system still makes sense, including me. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Returned. You said you would stay through treatment. My fingers stopped over the screen. When did I say that? The answer arrived almost immediately. Mom said you already agreed. A slow pressure built behind my ribs. Not anger. Exactly. Recognition. Agreed to what? This time the pause was longer. To stay here. To do the evaluation. To help until this is over. Until this is over. Sophie's condition had no neat end date. Everyone knew that. Sophie, I agreed to get information and complete the initial evaluation. I never agreed to put my life on hold indefinitely. Her response came in fragments. She said you did. Then, she said you told her Denver could wait. That sentence took me back 5 years to Portland. Mom crying. I don't know what we'd do without you right now. My phone felt heavier in my hand. She may have told you something I didn't say. Sophie answered. So now this is Mom's fault? A dozen defensive replies crowded forward. None of them would help. Instead, I typed, "What happened at my wedding is still your responsibility too." No answer. So I continued. Mom may have told you I promised. You still smiled when they tore my photo. The typing indicator appeared. Stopped. Appeared again. Finally. I was angry. I know. Another pause. I thought you were backing out after telling us you'd stay. There it was. Not an apology. Not enough. But information. For the first time, Sophie and I were discussing what had actually been said instead of what Mom had carried between us. A different question occurred to me. Send me your appointment list. Why? Because I want to know what you actually have scheduled. Not what Mom says is coming. Yours. Several minutes passed. Daniel finished the dishes, dried his hands, and looked over. What happened? Sophie thinks I promised to stay. Did you? No. That word was getting easier. My phone vibrated. A file arrived. Sophie had exported the appointments she currently had on her calendar. I opened it on my laptop, then opened the handwritten list Mom had given me the week before the wedding. My eyes moved between them. Specialist follow-ups. Testing. A rehabilitation consult. Routine visits. Several items on Mom's list were not appointments at all. They were tasks. Call insurer. Pick up prescription. Confirm referral. Reschedule imaging. Arrange transportation. Follow up with billing. Mom had bundled all of it together and called it Sophie's medical schedule. More important, the actual number of appointments was nowhere near what I had been picturing when she said 6 months of help. Daniel came around behind me, but didn't lean over the screen until I shifted the laptop toward him. That's it? That's what Sophie sent. He looked at the second list. What are all those? I touched one line with my finger. Work, not medical treatment. Not procedures only I could provide. Work, the kind I had been doing so consistently that my mother had stopped separating my labor from Sophie's illness. For 9 years, I had believed the question was whether Sophie needed me. Looking at those two lists side by side, a different question finally took shape. How much did Sophie actually need? And how much had everyone simply become accustomed to taking? The two lists stayed open on my laptop until almost midnight. One was Sophie's actual calendar. The other was everything Mom had wrapped around it until the difference between medical need and unpaid labor had disappeared. The longer I looked, the harder that was to unsee. An appointment was an appointment. Calling an insurer because a claim code was wrong was work. Driving across town because Dad hated downtown traffic was work. Waiting 40 minutes at a pharmacy because Sophie's prescription was not ready was work. Moving one of my own meetings because Mom had scheduled something without checking with me first was work. None of that meant Sophie did not need support. It meant support had quietly become a word large enough to swallow my entire schedule. The next morning, I texted Sophie. Can we meet without Mom? She replied after 15 minutes. Why? Because I want to hear from you directly. Another pause. Then, Saturday, 10. The coffee place near Green Lake. When I arrived, Sophie was already seated at a table near the window. She had chosen the seat with the light behind her, instead of in front of her. That was one of those small adaptations I had seen her make so often I barely registered them anymore. Her phone rested on the table with the text enlarged. A white cane leaned against the wall beside her chair. For the first few minutes, neither of us touched the real subject. She asked how married life felt. I told her Daniel had already complained that I owned too many coffee mugs. She smiled despite herself. Then the smile disappeared. So, she said, you wanted to interrogate me? No, that's what Mom says you're doing. There it was. Mom said. The phrase had started to sound different to me. Not harmless. Not neutral. A relay point. I want to know what you actually need, I said. Her shoulders tightened. I need my eyesight. I know. And you can't give me that. No, that's not what I meant. Then tell me what you meant. The barista set down 2 drinks. Sophie waited until the footsteps moved away. I need help getting places. Some of the buildings are awful. I can't always read the signage. Sometimes the lighting makes everything worse. That makes sense. I hate asking strangers. That also makes sense. Her fingers moved around the cardboard sleeve. And when I get bad news, I don't want to be alone. That one landed differently. There was no manipulation in the sentence that I could hear, just fear. For years, I had responded to that fear by turning myself into an all-purpose solution. Maybe because it was easier to solve logistics than sit beside someone while they were scared. What else? I asked. Sophie looked toward the window. I don't know. Can you make your own appointments? Yes. Call insurance? She gave me a look. I'm visually impaired, Leah. I'm not incompetent. The shame was immediate. You're right. That was badly asked. She leaned back. Mom usually does it because she thinks they listen to her more. Do they? No idea. Usually I let her. Could you handle it if you had the right numbers and the notes in one place? Probably. Could you use transportation sometimes? Her mouth tightened. I hate that idea. Okay. But hate isn't the same as can't. That answer made me look up. Sophie rubbed the edge of the cup with her thumb. I know I've let you do a lot. There was no apology attached to it. Not yet. Still, it was more honest than I had expected. How much did you think I was doing? She frowned. Driving. Some insurance stuff. Pharmacy sometimes. And the rest? What rest? My phone sat between us. The temptation to open the ledger was strong. To show her the number of appointments, the money, the PTO, to make the scale undeniable. Instead, I asked, when was the last time you scheduled your own specialist follow-up? She thought about it. I don't know. Prescription refill? Mom usually. She stopped. That was enough. Sophie stared at the table for several seconds. Then she said, I didn't ask you to do all of it. No. Her eyes came back toward me. You volunteered. Sometimes. That sounds like you're blaming me for something you offered. It would be easier if that were all this was. Her jaw tightened. I kept my voice level. Mom volunteered me too. That landed. Sophie looked away. After a moment, she said, she told me you wanted to help. I did want to help. Then what changed? Wanting to help isn't the same as wanting my life organized around it. She flinched slightly. The old reflex came up hard. Soften it. Reassure her. Say, of course I'll always be there. Instead, I let the sentence stand. Sophie tapped one fingernail against the lid of her cup. What are you actually asking me to do? It was the first question anyone had asked me that wasn't about what I intended to give. Help me separate what you truly need from what everyone is simply used to me handling. She considered that, then nodded once. We spent the next hour going through her calendar. Not her diagnosis. Not her private medical details. Just logistics. Which visits required someone to accompany her? Which were routine? Which locations she could navigate with enough preparation? Which tasks she could handle herself? Which ones she avoided because Mom had always done them first? The answer was messier than a neat plan, but it was nowhere near the impossible burden Mom had been describing. At one point, Sophie said, the rehabilitation consult doesn't need you there. Mom put me down for it. She put everybody down for everything. Can you get there? Probably. Do you want me there? Her face changed. That question was harder. Maybe. Then ask me for that one. She looked at me. Just that one? For now. Her mouth tightened again. I don't like this. I know. It feels like you're making me apply for help. That isn't what I'm trying to do. What does it feel like to you? The answer came before I could make it prettier. Like I'm learning the difference between helping you and disappearing into helping you. Neither of us spoke. A bus hissed to a stop outside. Sophie reached for her cane when we stood to leave. At the door, she stopped. About the wedding. My body went still. She swallowed. Mom told me you'd already decided not to stay. That doesn't answer what happened. I know. The old Sophie would have pushed. Explained. Asked me to understand why she was angry. This time she only said, I know. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't enough. But it was the first time she had allowed the hurt to exist without immediately asking me to carry her reasons for it. That afternoon, we called the clinic liaison together. Sophie handled the portions related to her care. When anything shifted toward my involvement, I spoke for myself. That alone felt strange. The liaison walked us through resources. The clinic routinely gave patients transportation contacts, accessibility support, patient navigation, telehealth where medically appropriate, and community services that could help with certain practical gaps. None of it was miraculous. None of it eliminated the fact that Sophie would still need help. It did something more important. It proved the world did not end at the edge of my availability. By Sunday evening, the dining table in our apartment had disappeared under paper. Daniel came in carrying takeout and stopped in the doorway. Should I be worried? Depends. Is that a threat matrix? It's a care transition plan. That sounded worse somehow. A laugh escaped me. Then I looked down at the pages again. 4 workable models had begun to take shape. Parents, splitting transportation. A family rotation combined with vetted transportation. Paid support for specific gaps. More self-management for Sophie, with backup when truly needed. Under every version, there were tasks that still needed someone. That was the part I refused to pretend away. The mistake would have been replacing one fantasy with another. Sophie was not suddenly independent because I needed Denver. Mom was not suddenly wrong about every difficulty because she had lied about urgency. The plan had to work in real life. Otherwise, it was just revenge disguised as organization. Daniel set the food down. What does your name mean there? At the bottom of the page, I had written, Leah backup. That means I help when there's an emergency. He pulled out a chair. What counts as an emergency? I stared at the word. Good question. In my family, emergency had become dangerously flexible. A canceled ride could become one. A pharmacy line could become one. Mom feeling overwhelmed could become one. Something unexpected that genuinely can't be handled another way. That sounds better. I crossed out backup and rewrote it. Leah, emergency backup only. Not routine caregiver. The words looked severe on paper. Almost unkind. That was how boundaries often looked to me before anyone even challenged them. The next day, I sent the plan to Mom, Dad, Sophie, and Aunt Carol. The email was short. No accusations. No history lesson. No wedding. Just the practical question. If I accept Denver, this is what Sophie will still need. These are realistic ways to cover it. Please tell me which responsibilities each person can take. Dad replied first. Downtown appointments will be difficult for me. My night vision isn't what it used to be. That was fair enough. I moved him away from evening driving. Carol answered. Saturdays are hard because I usually help with the grandkids. Also fair. I marked her as occasional backup rather than regular transport. Mom called instead of replying. I let it go to voicemail. Her message lasted 2 minutes. Leah, this whole thing is insulting. Sophie is not a corporate project, and we are not going to assign her to strangers like she's a delivery route. I cannot believe this is what you've become. I listened once, then emailed back. Which parts of the plan do you think are unsafe or unworkable? Please be specific. Her answer came 20 minutes later. All of it. That was the first answer that truly changed my understanding. Not because it was angry, because it was impossible. 4 different models, different combinations, different levels of outside help, different amounts of responsibility for each person. All of them could not be unacceptable for the same reason unless the reason had nothing to do with the details. That evening, Mom called again. This time I answered. You're treating Sophie like a burden, she said. I'm trying to make sure the support continues. By outsourcing her? By making sure one person isn't responsible for everything. You are not one person. You're her sister. The sentence sat there. Not one person. Her sister. As if relationship erased personhood. Dad can take some appointments, I said. He gets tired. Carol said she can do an occasional weekday. She has grandchildren. There are transportation services. I don't want strangers taking Sophie. We can vet them. No. Paid assistance for administrative work. We are not paying outsiders when we have family. What about the parts Sophie can do herself? Her answer came even faster. She has enough to deal with. There it was again. Every route closed. Dad too tired. Carol too busy. Strangers too risky. Paid help too expensive. Sophie too burdened. Only one option remained miraculously free of defects. Me. What if I stay? I asked. Mom's voice softened immediately. Then we have time. For what? To get Sophie through this. What changes after 6 months? Silence. Mom? We'll know more. That isn't an answer. Her tone sharpened. Why do you need everything quantified? Because you're asking me to give up something real. And your sister isn't real? My hand tightened around the phone. That isn't what I said. It's what you're making this into. The conversation ended 10 minutes later without one specific 6-month milestone. Afterward, I added a note beside each rejected option. Not to build a case. To make sure I did not later convince myself those conversations had gone differently. The next call came from Aunt Carol. At first, I expected another lecture. Instead, she surprised me. Your mother says you're leaving. I'm considering a transfer. She says you've already decided. Of course she does. Carol sighed. That tone won't help. Probably not. A long pause followed. Then, she said, your mother is scared. So am I. She doesn't know how to do this without you. The sentence almost sounded compassionate until I examined it. Why not? Carol made a small noise. What? Why doesn't she know how to do it without me? She spent years taking care of Sophie. So have I. You know what I mean. No, I'm not sure I do anymore. Carol was quiet. Then she said, your mother has always been like this about caregiving. Something in her tone made me stop writing. What does that mean? She took care of Grandma. I knew that, generally. What I had never known were the details. Carol told me Evelyn had been 20 when their mother became ill for an extended period. There had been 3 brothers. Carol was still a teenager. Evelyn left school for a semester. Then another. She did everything, Carol said. Appointments, meals, cleaning, bills. The boys helped when they could, but you know how things were then. No, I didn't, but I knew enough about that sentence. How long? Almost 2 years. Something tightened in my chest. Did she go back to school? Eventually. Did anyone ever ask one of the brothers to leave school? Carol did not answer immediately. That's not really fair. Why? Because Evelyn was the oldest girl. The phrase was so ordinary in Carol's voice that it almost hurt more than Mom screaming at the wedding. What did Grandma say about it? Carol chuckled faintly. She used to call Evelyn the daughter who never walked away. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not an excuse. An inheritance. Mom had once been the capable daughter, the one who carried what everyone else could not. Maybe no one had called it exploitation then. Maybe they had called it devotion. Maybe that was why she could look at my life and see nothing wrong. Understanding that did not make the wedding portrait whole again. It did not make the false urgency acceptable. It only made the pattern older. Carol continued. You know, Leah, sometimes that's just what daughters do. The sympathy disappeared from my body almost instantly. Maybe that's what someone taught Mom she had to do. Carol sighed. And now you're going to blame Grandma? No. I looked at the care plan beside me. I'm saying I don't have to inherit every rule that hurt the woman who raised me. Carol went quiet. The call ended politely. Nothing was resolved. But after it, anger stopped being the only thing I felt toward my mother. There was grief now, too. Not for the mother I wished she had been. For the 20-year-old version of Evelyn who had apparently learned that good daughters proved their worth by becoming unavailable to themselves. Compassion complicated the picture. It did not change the boundary. 3 days later, Mom came to our apartment. Daniel was still at work. She carried a narrow shopping bag and set it on the kitchen counter. I don't want to fight, she said. Neither did I. That was what made what followed dangerous. She pulled a glossy brochure from the bag. A photography studio. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then she opened it to a page of large framed portraits. We can replace it. My throat tightened. The wedding portrait. I talked to the photographer, Mom said. She can print another one. You called our photographer? I was trying to fix something. The defensive edge appeared, then disappeared again. Mom touched the page. I shouldn't have torn it. It was the closest thing to an apology she had offered. Not a full one. Not an acknowledgement of the ultimatum. Not an acknowledgement of using Sophie's illness in front of 200 people. But enough to reach the part of me that had been waiting almost 40 years for her to admit she had hurt me. We can move past this, she said. The old instinct rose immediately. How? What would I have to do? Mom answered, before I asked. Stay 6 months. There it was. Quietly. Almost gently. Help Sophie through this part. Don't move right now. We'll stop talking about the wedding. I'll apologize to Daniel. My fingers rested on the edge of the brochure. And Denver? 6 months from now, if you still want it, you can go. The position won't exist 6 months from now. There will be other jobs. The words came so easily. My job. My promotion. My timing. All replaceable. Then she gave me the part designed specifically for the child I still became around her. I'll tell everyone you came through for your sister. My eyes lifted. Mom leaned closer. You won't have to leave with everyone thinking you abandoned us. For one dangerous second, the offer worked. Not because I cared what Aunt Carol thought. Not because Denver suddenly mattered less. Because hidden inside Mom's bargain was the thing I had wanted for years. Recognition. Approval. A clean exit. Do this one last thing, and I would finally be released as a good daughter. 6 months. The number sounded manageable. That night, my calendar filled itself before I realized what I was doing. Remote work possibilities. Flights. Bito. Maybe I could negotiate a later start. Maybe Mara could hold something else. Maybe Daniel could move first. Maybe I could spend weekdays here and weekends there. Maybe 6 months would become 4. Maybe Sophie would stabilize. Maybe Mom would finally say I had done enough. By 11, the dining table was covered again. Daniel came home, loosened his tie, and stared at the pages. What happened? Mom came by. He waited. She apologized. Sort of. For the wedding? For tearing the picture. That's not exactly the same thing. I know. He sat across from me. What are all these options? For what? 6 months. His face didn't change much. That helped. If he had gotten angry, I could have defended Mom. If he had ordered me not to stay, I could have resented him. Instead, he picked up one page. You could probably make this work. Relief flashed through me. Yes. Daniel put the page down. Why are you solving their demand instead of deciding whether it's yours? Everything in me went still. The calendar blurred slightly. Not because of tears. Because I suddenly saw the pattern from above. Mom wanted 6 months. My first instinct had not been to ask whether 6 months belonged to her. It had been to engineer myself around it. That was what I did. At work, it was a strength. At home, it had become a trap. A difficult request appeared, and instead of deciding whether to accept it, I automatically started making it possible. The transfer packet was in my work bag. Acceptance deadline. 2 days. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then the laptop came closer. Mara's email opened. The acceptance form loaded. My cursor rested over the signature field. There was no triumph in that moment. My stomach hurt. My hands were unsteady. Some choices hurt because they are wrong. Others hurt because they close the door on the hope that everyone will someday let you leave without punishing you for it. My name went into the field. Leah Morgan. Submit. The confirmation appeared a few seconds later. Denver was no longer an option I was considering. It was my next address. Only then did I open the care plan again. At the bottom, beneath every workable alternative, I left my role exactly as written. Leah emergency backup only. Not routine caregiver. I emailed the final version to Mom, Dad, Sophie, and Carol. Mom replied less than 10 minutes later. Then come to dinner Friday and explain to the whole family why strangers matter more than your sister. The message sat on the screen. A month earlier, I would have spent the evening constructing a defense. This time, I opened the care rotation sheet instead. Empty names. Empty slots. Real tasks. Real dates. For years, everyone had told me that family helped family. Friday night, I was finally going to find out what they meant when the help had to come from someone other than me. By Friday afternoon, the care rotation sheet had changed 3 times. Not because the plan had changed. Because every time I looked at it, some part of me wanted to make it softer, less confrontational, more forgiving. I deleted the column labeled primary responsibility because it sounded too much like an assignment. I changed commitment to available support. I removed the estimated hours beside each task. Then I put the hours back. Not to embarrass anyone. Because a 2-hour appointment became a 5-hour block when you included driving, parking, waiting, pharmacy stops, and traffic. That had been the trick of the past 9 years. Everyone remembered the appointment. Nobody remembered the life wrapped around it. By 5:30, the final packet contained only what anyone at the table actually needed to know. No private medical details. No diagnosis history. No copies of clinic notes. Just categories of support, estimated time, and the options Sophie and I had already discussed. Daniel stood near the kitchen counter while I slid the pages into a plain folder. "You still want me there?" he asked. "Yes. Do you want me to say anything?" "No," he nodded. "If somebody comes at me?" Still no. A corner of his mouth moved. "That's going to be fun." "It won't be." "I know." The folder went into my bag. My phone followed. Then the transfer confirmation. Not because I intended to wave it around. Because knowing it existed changed how I walked into that house. For most of my adult life, difficult conversations with my parents had carried an invisible condition. At some point, I would have to go home and live with whatever they decided. Not anymore. The front door opened before I knocked. Mom stood there in a navy sweater, hair carefully brushed, lipstick on. She looked more prepared for company than conflict. "Come in," she said. Her eyes moved to Daniel. "I didn't know you were coming." "He's my husband." "I know who he is, Leah." The old me would have rushed to smooth that over. Instead, I stepped inside. Voices came from the dining room. Aunt Carol was there. So were my mother's cousin Linda, Uncle James, my cousin Melissa and her husband, and another aunt who lived less than 20 minutes away and had sent me 3 messages about remembering what matters. Sophie sat near the end of the table. Dad stood by the sideboard, pouring wine. It wasn't dinner. It was an intervention with roasted chicken. Mom had even put the good serving dishes out. That detail almost made me laugh. She followed me into the room. "Everyone's here because they care about what's happening." Carol gave me a tight smile. "We just want to help." My fingers closed around the strap of my bag. Help. The word had never been in short supply. Only the labor behind it. Daniel took the chair beside mine. He didn't reach for my hand. Didn't whisper encouragement. He just sat. Exactly as I had asked. Dad carried the wine bottle around the table. "Let's eat before this gets ugly." "Thomas," Mom said. "What?" "You make it sound like we're attacking her." Nobody answered that. Dinner began with small talk so artificial that every fork against a plate sounded too loud. Linda asked about the wedding venue. Melissa complimented Mom's chicken. James mentioned traffic. No one mentioned the fact that the last time most of these people had seen me together, my mother had been standing over 2 halves of my wedding portrait. Halfway through the meal, Mom set her fork down. "Okay, there it was." She folded her hands. "We're not going to keep pretending there isn't a problem." My appetite disappeared. "Fine." Her gaze stayed on me. "You've decided to move to Denver while Sophie is going through one of the hardest periods of her life." The phrasing was clean. Almost elegant. No false statement. Just enough omission to turn my decision into abandonment. Mom continued. "We all understand that Leah has a career. Nobody is saying she shouldn't." Carol nodded. Dad stared at his plate. "But there are times," Mom said, "when being part of a family means doing what is inconvenient." Several faces turned toward me. A tiny pressure formed behind my eyes. Not fear. Memory. For years, this was the moment when I surrendered. Not because they had proved anything. Because being watched made disagreement feel like guilt. Mom leaned back. "We're asking for 6 months. James spoke from across the table. "That doesn't sound unreasonable." I looked at him. He had texted me after the wedding. "Your sister would do the same for you." Melissa added, "Jobs come and go." Dad finally looked up. "Nobody is asking you to sacrifice forever." Aunt Carol reached for her water. "Your mother did this for Grandma." "I told you that." "Yes. You know what she gave up." "I do." Mom's eyes flicked toward Carol. For the first time that evening, irritation crossed her face. Maybe she hadn't expected that piece of history to become part of the conversation. Carol continued anyway. "That's what people do when someone needs them." There it was again. People. Not Leah. Not daughters. People. That made what I had brought almost painfully simple. "I agree." The table went quiet. Mom blinked. You do? Yes. Her shoulders lowered slightly. For once, she said. Thank you. My bag came onto my lap. The folder came out. I agree that when someone needs help, the people who love them should share it. Mom's expression changed before I even opened the folder. Not much. Just enough. The first sheet went in the center of the table. Dad leaned forward. What is that? The actual support Sophie and I identified together. Mom turned toward Sophie. You gave her this? Sophie's fingers tightened around her napkin. She asked me what I needed. That's not what I asked. Sophie looked down. I kept going. Some appointments require transportation. Some don't. Some administrative work can be handled by Sophie. Some can be split. There are also transportation services and paid support options for gaps. Mom's mouth tightened. We already discussed this. We did. And I said those weren't acceptable. Right. Another sheet went down. This is the part we didn't discuss. The page was divided by task and availability. No names had been assigned. No traps. No gotcha. Just open spaces. Carol leaned toward it. What are we looking at? If we all believe Sophie should be supported by the people who care about her, then we can decide who can realistically do what. A strange stillness settled over the room. Mom gave a short laugh. You invited us here to schedule people? No, you invited us. That stopped her. The pen came out of my bag. I placed it beside the sheet. I'm just asking who's available. James leaned back. I don't know her medical situation well enough. You wouldn't need to. Transportation doesn't require knowing her medical details. He looked at Sophie. What kind of transportation? Mostly appointments, Sophie said. Her voice was quieter than usual. How often? She told him. Not me. Not Mom. Sophie. The number sounded smaller when it came directly from her. James rubbed his chin. I could probably do something once in a while. Great, I said. Which days tend to work? His face changed. Well, I travel a lot. Okay. Some weeks. No problem. The pen remained where it was. He did not pick it up. Carol cleared her throat. I already told you Saturdays are difficult. I remember. I watch the grandkids. I know. Maybe a weekday occasionally. Which weekday? She frowned. Leah, people don't plan their whole lives months in advance. The irony almost escaped as a laugh. I'm not asking for months. I'm asking what you can reliably do. Melissa shifted beside her husband. I have the kids' activities. Okay, Linda said. I'm terrible driving downtown, Dad muttered. Join the club. For several minutes, the sheet moved nowhere. Words did. We should help. Of course. When possible. Anytime she really needs it. Call me if there's an emergency. One commitment after another that disappeared when attached to a date. Mom watched the conversation deteriorate. Finally, she pushed the paper away. This is absurd. My eyes went to her. How? You can't reduce caring for your sister to boxes on a sheet. I'm not reducing anything. That's exactly what you're doing. No. I'm making the work visible. Carol looked uncomfortable. Dad folded his arms. Mom continued. Sophie needs consistency. Agreed. She needs somebody she trusts. Agreed. She is comfortable with you. There it was. The sentence I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. Then this was never about whether someone could help Sophie. Mom stared at me. It was about whether I would. Nobody moved. She shook her head. That is such a selfish way to twist this. Is it? Yes. Dad can drive some appointments. He gets tired. Carol can do occasional weekdays. She has responsibilities. James said he wants to help. James looked suddenly fascinated by his wine glass. Transportation services exist. They're strangers. Paid assistance exists. We shouldn't have to pay for something family can do. What about the things Sophie can do herself? Mom's voice sharpened. She has enough to deal with. Every route. Closed. The same way it had been on the phone. Only now there were witnesses. Not witnesses to a secret. Witnesses to a pattern they were helping create in real time. Mom pointed at me. You are her sister. My gaze moved around the table. Then what are they? Her mouth opened. No answer came immediately. She recovered quickly. That isn't what I mean. I know exactly what you mean. No, you don't. Then explain it. Her palm landed flat beside her plate. Not hard enough to rattle anything. Still, everyone stopped moving. You have always been the one Sophie can count on. That's true. And now, because you got married and someone offered you a bigger title, suddenly you want to act like none of that matters. None of what? All the years you two have been close. I looked at Sophie. She had gone very still. We were close before I became her transportation system. Mom's face flushed. That is disgusting. Why? Because she is not a burden. I never called her one. You are treating her like one. No, I'm treating the work like work. Dad leaned forward. That's enough. For the first time, my attention shifted to him fully. Why? Because you've made your point. Which point? That you're angry. A strange calm settled over me. No. He frowned. I was angry at the wedding. My hands rested flat on the table. Tonight I'm being practical. Dad looked toward Mom, then back at me. You knew Sophie needed support before you took the Denver job. Yes. And you took it anyway. Yes. He blinked. Maybe he expected explanation. None came. The word stood on its own. Yes. A complete sentence. Across from me, Sophie lifted her head. Did Mom tell you I already agreed to stay? The question was aimed at me at first. Then she turned toward Evelyn. Did you? Mom's posture stiffened. This is not about that. It kind of is. Sophie, you told me Leah had already said Denver could wait. Mom exhaled. I said what I believed she would do. Something in my chest shifted. Not victory. Confirmation. Sophie stared toward her. That's not the same thing. You were scared. So you told me? She promised. Mom's eyes moved around the table. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Everyone turning against everyone. Nobody had turned against anyone. That was what struck me. No one had accused her of plotting. No one had raised their voice except her. The structure had simply stopped protecting the story. Sophie turned back toward me. You could have told me sooner. The sentence stung, partly because there was truth in it. I tried to correct things. You didn't tell me Mom was lying. At first, I didn't know she was. Sophie's jaw tightened. And later? Later, I was trying to figure out what was actually happening. So you investigated us? No. The word came fast. I checked what I had agreed to. Then I asked you directly what you needed. Her mouth pressed into a line. You always make everything sound so reasonable. That one hit harder than it should have. Maybe because it carried years of resentment I had never asked about. Maybe because I could hear the accusation underneath it. You get to be competent. You get to be composed. You get to leave. For a second, the urge to comfort her almost won. Then I remembered her smile at the reception. Mom may have told you something that wasn't true, I said. You were still there when they tore my wedding photo. Her face changed. I was angry. I know. I thought you were abandoning me. I know. You keep saying that, because understanding why you did it doesn't make it okay. That ended the exchange. Not because we had solved anything. Because there was nowhere honest to go after that sentence. Mom pushed her chair back. Fine. AP. She stood. If this is what you need, then fine. You've made everyone uncomfortable. Congratulations. My pulse kicked up. There was the old trap. If other people were uncomfortable, I had caused harm. Mom walked to the sideboard and came back with the photography brochure she had brought to my apartment. She placed it in front of me. I offered to fix this. My fingers stayed in my lap. I offered to apologize to Daniel. I offered to put the wedding behind us. All I asked was 6 months. All? She flinched at the word. Yes, all. The Denver position won't wait 6 months. There will be other jobs. There may not be this one. You're choosing a job over your sister. No. Then stay. The room held its breath. For years, Mom had been able to create a choice and then name whichever answer she wanted as the moral one. Stay, or you don't love us. Give, or you're selfish. Agree, or you're making things difficult. That night, something about the mechanism looked embarrassingly obvious. I already accepted Denver. The words landed without volume. Dad's head came up. What? Mom stared at me. You what? The transfer is accepted. My start date is set. You did that without talking to us? That question nearly took me apart. Not because it was powerful. Because once, I would have believed it was normal. You knew I was considering it. That is not the same as deciding. No, it isn't. Dad shook his head. You made a decision this big without your parents? Yes. The room went still again. This time, the silence felt different. Not judgment. Recalibration. For the first time, they were hearing the actual change. Not the care plan. Not the arguments. The decision. Mom's face tightened. When? Earlier this week. Before this dinner? Yes. Then why are we even here? You invited me. To talk. We are talking. No, you came here after making up your mind. That's true. Her lips parted. Nothing came out for a beat. Then she pointed toward the sheets. So this was just a performance? No. Sophie still needs support after I move. Not from you, apparently. From me when I choose and when I genuinely can. Mom laughed once. Listen to yourself. I am. The answer came quieter than everything else. And for the first time in a long time, I like what I'm hearing. Daniel did not move beside me. That mattered. No protective interruption. No husband versus parents. No new person taking over the old system. Just me. Mom picked up the brochure. I told you I would replace the portrait. My eyes fell to the glossy example on the cover. A smiling couple in a gold frame. That was never the part that needed replacing. Her hand stopped. The chair moved back beneath me. My folder went into my bag. The care rotation sheet stayed on the table. Not as evidence. As an option. If anyone wants to help Sophie, the plan is there. Sophie has a copy too. Dad stood. So that's it? No. What else is there? From now on, medical decisions involving me come through me. No one promises my time for me. No one tells Sophie I agreed to something unless I actually did. And if I help, it's because I said yes, not because somebody else decided I should. Mom folded her arms. And when there's an emergency? If there is a real emergency and I can help, call me. You'll be in another state. Yes. Her expression said that was proof of something. Maybe abandonment. Maybe betrayal. Maybe failure. I no longer needed to know which word she would choose. Routine care is not an emergency, I added. A scheduling problem is not an emergency. Somebody not wanting to drive downtown is not an emergency. Dad looked away. Good. At least that one had landed where it belonged. Sophie still had not stood. Our eyes met. I'm not disappearing, I told her. She gave me a strained smile. Just moving. Yes. That's going to feel pretty similar sometimes. Maybe. It hurt to admit that. I'm still going. Her expression tightened. Then, she nodded once. Not approval. Not forgiveness. Recognition. It was enough for that night. Daniel stood with me. Mom did not walk us to the door. Dad did. In the entryway, he spoke quietly. Your mother thinks Daniel pushed you into this. Of course she did. It was easier than believing I had changed without a new authority replacing her. Daniel didn't accept the job. Dad rubbed the side of his jaw. You know what I mean. No. I don't think I do anymore. He looked older under the hallway light than he had at dinner. For a second, guilt tried another door. Dad tired. Mom afraid. Sophie struggling. Carol busy. Everyone had a reason. That had always been the problem. Their reasons had become my obligations. My reasons had remained negotiable. Good night, Dad. He opened the door. Leah. I turned. He looked back toward the dining room. Then at me. You could still change your mind. The old ache surfaced. The desire to hear something different. We'll miss you. I'm proud of you. I should have helped more. Instead, I got one final invitation to surrender. No, I said. I can't. That wasn't entirely true. Technically, I could. People can undo almost any boundary if they are willing to pay enough for it. What I meant was that I was done paying. The next morning, moving boxes were stacked along one wall of our apartment. Daniel was wrapping dishes in paper while I sorted the office closet. My phone buzzed inside an open drawer. A text from Dad. Your mother says if you go, don't expect this house to feel like home when you come back. For a long moment, I read it without moving. There had been a time when those words would have ended the Denver plan. Home had always been the leverage beneath everything else. Behave correctly, and the door remained open. Disappoint them, and belonging became conditional. The wedding ultimatum had simply said out loud what had been operating quietly for years. Choose her, or leave this family. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. A dozen replies came to mind. Some sharp, some defensive, some begging him to understand. None of them felt necessary. The phone went face down on the desk. Across the room, Daniel held up 2 identical coffee mugs. Do we really need both? Yes. They are literally the same mug. They're emotionally distinct. He stared at me. That sentence is why moving is going to cost us extra. I laughed. A real laugh this time. Then my eyes returned to the message on the desk. Don't expect this house to feel like home when you come back. For years, every difficult decision had been shaped by the assumption that eventually I would need to return. Back to their table. Back to my role. Back to the version of me who fixed things before anyone else felt the cost. The apartment around me was half-packed. Denver paperwork sat in a folder by the door. My wedding portrait was still in 2 pieces. Nothing about my life looked settled. Yet the strangest realization arrived with almost no drama at all. For the first time, I wasn't trying to come back. Denver felt too quiet at first. That surprised me. For years, I had imagined freedom as relief. A door opening, a weight lifting, something obvious enough that I would recognize it the moment it arrived. Instead, our first Saturday in the new apartment, I woke before 7 because no one had called. No voicemail from Mom. No text from Dad asking whether I could take Sophie somewhere, since I was already up. No message from Sophie with a screenshot of an insurance portal she wanted me to interpret. The silence should have felt peaceful. Instead, my hand reached for the phone before my eyes were fully open. Nothing. Daniel was still asleep beside me. Boxes lined one wall of the bedroom. Our bed frame had arrived 2 days earlier, but we still had clothes in suitcases and 6 mismatched glasses in the kitchen because I had underestimated how long unpacking would take. My transfer had started that Monday. Mara had introduced me to the Denver team without mentioning anything about Seattle beyond the obvious. Leah knows how to find the place where a schedule is lying to you, she told them. A few people laughed. I did too. The sentence followed me home. A schedule lying to you. For years, mine had said I had weekends. It just never mentioned they belonged to someone else. That first week at work was exhausting in a way I had missed. Good exhausting. My brain was full of sequencing issues, resource constraints, delivery windows, and a rail-adjacent utility project that had 3 contractors pretending the same 2-week window could belong to all of them. By Thursday, one of the younger schedulers asked how I knew a subcontractor's promised date was unrealistic. Because every task before it requires everything to go right. He frowned. So, nothing goes right that consistently. That got a laugh. Then I showed him where the float actually disappeared. Useful still felt good. That had never been the problem. The problem was, believing usefulness was the price of being allowed to stay. My phone buzzed during lunch on the second Friday. Dad. For a second, my body responded before my mind did. Shoulders tense, breath shallow, thumb already moving. Then, I stopped. No emergency indicator existed on a phone screen, just a name. The message read, "Taking Sophie to the eye center Monday. Do you remember which parking garage has the easiest elevator access?" That was all. No accusation. No reminder that I had left. No guilt. A normal question. My first instinct was to call and explain the entire route. Which entrance? Where to turn? What floor to park on? Which elevator opened closest to the clinic? Where the coffee kiosk was if Sophie needed a break. My thumb hovered over his name. Then I opened maps instead. I sent the garage address and wrote, "Use the east elevator bank. It's closest to the clinic entrance. The accessibility desk can help if you get turned around." 3 dots appeared. Thanks. That was it. The phone went face down. Something small had changed. I had helped. I had not taken over. The difference would have sounded ridiculous to me a year earlier. Now it felt structural. 2 weeks later, Aunt Carol texted, "Your father says those hospital garages are awful." I smiled despite myself. They are. A minute passed. Then, I took Sophie to her rehab consult yesterday. I understand why you hated parking there. My eyebrows lifted. That was new. Carol followed it with, she did fine. We got lunch after. No lecture. No, see, family helps family. Just a report. A small one. I wrote, glad it went smoothly. Several minutes later, another message appeared. I can probably do 1 weekday a month. Not more. The sentence was more useful than every speech she had given me before Denver. 1 weekday. Not more. A boundary. Specific. Real. I saved it in the care plan. Not because I still managed the schedule. Sophie did now. But because part of learning not to carry everything was learning to recognize when other people finally named what they could actually carry. Dad's messages changed too. At first, they were mostly logistical. Where was the pharmacy? Which insurance number had I called? Did Sophie usually bring the large print folder to appointments? The first time he asked that last question, something almost bitter rose in me. He had lived in the same house as Sophie for years. How could he not know? The answer came just as quickly. Because I always knew. Because Mom always knew. Because someone else knowing made it possible for him not to. A sharp reply formed. Instead, I sent. She usually brings it. Ask her what she wants to take. He responded. Okay. That became my new favorite word. Okay. Not a transformation. Not accountability. Just the absence of argument. Natural consequences arrived quietly. Mom had insisted paid assistance was unnecessary. 3 weeks after I moved, Sophie told me they had hired someone for a few hours a week to help with paperwork and transportation gaps. The news came during a phone call. They found somebody through one of the services the clinic recommended, Sophie said. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Do you like her? She's organized. That sounds promising. She labels everything. That sounds terrifying. Sophie laughed. It was brief, but real. Then she said, Mom hates paying for it. There was an old opening there. A chance to say, I told you so. I let it pass. How's it working for you? Pretty well. That's what matters. Sophie was quiet for a second. Then she said, Dad's been driving more. How's that going? He complains about traffic. That sounds like Dad. He got lost in the parking garage. That also sounds like Dad. Another laugh. Something in my chest loosened. Not because things were fixed. Because the world had not collapsed when I stopped being its support beam. Other people adjusted. Some badly. Some grudgingly. Some more capably than they had ever been required to prove. And Sophie adjusted too. That mattered most. About a month after the move, Mom found another route to me. Not directly. My cousin Melissa sent a message late one evening. I don't want to get in the middle, but Aunt Evelyn is really struggling. She says you barely call anymore and Sophie is going through all this without you. The old defense prepared itself automatically. Sophie is not without me. Dad is driving. They hired support. Carol helps. I still talk to Sophie. The care plan exists. All of it was true. None of it belonged in a courtroom that Melissa had not been invited to hold. So I wrote, Sophie has a care plan and support. If you're worried she needs more, ask her directly what would be helpful. Melissa replied, I just think your mom misses you. That was different. She can call me without asking me to move back. No response came. 2 days later, Mom left a voicemail. I listened because I had decided not to turn no contact into a punishment I did not actually want. Leah, I don't know what you've been telling people, but your cousin called me asking if she could help Sophie with transportation. I am not discussing our private business with everyone. The contradiction was almost elegant. For weeks, Mom had used other people to tell me what I owed. Now that those same people were being asked what they could contribute, suddenly the matter was private. The voicemail continued. You've made this into something it never was. No one expected you to do everything. That sentence made me sit down. The dining table was still temporary, a cheap folding one we had bought while waiting for the real table to arrive. My laptop was open in front of me. For 9 years, the proof of what had been expected was sitting in calendars, receipts, missed opportunities, and habits everyone had accepted. But I no longer needed to send Mom the archive. The result was already visible. When I stopped doing everything, they had to find more people. That was enough. I did not call back. Instead, I texted, I'm not discussing this through relatives. If you want to talk to me directly. I'm not resuming routine caregiving. Her response came an hour later. You always have to have rules now. I read it once, then locked the phone. Yes, that was the point. The hardest call came from Sophie. It was a Sunday evening. Daniel was reading on the couch while I chopped vegetables for dinner. Her name lit the screen. I answered. Hey, do you have a minute? The tone tightened something in me. Is something wrong? I need help figuring something out. My hand was already reaching for the laptop on the counter. I stopped halfway. The old sequence was so fast I almost missed it. Problem. Open computer. Take ownership. Solve. My hand lowered. Do you need help figuring it out? I asked. Or do you need me to do it? Silence filled the line. For one uncomfortable second, I regretted asking. Then Sophie said, figuring it out. Okay. She had received an insurance letter she did not understand. The language was dense, and the enlarged version on her screen did not make it any clearer. We went through it together. She read the key sections aloud. I asked what the clinic had told her. She found the number she needed to call. At one point, she said, Can you just call them tomorrow? The old answer almost came. Sure. Instead, no. But I can help you write down what to ask. Another pause. Right. For the next 10 minutes, we made a list. Not because she was incapable. Because new tasks are easier with a template the first time. When we finished, she exhaled. That's actually not that bad. No. I hate that you were right. I'll survive. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Then, neither of us ended the call. The kitchen faucet dripped once. Daniel turned a page in the next room. Finally, Sophie said, I've been thinking about the wedding. My knife stayed on the cutting board. Okay. Mom lied to me. Yes. That made me really angry. I know. I thought you had promised to stay, and then changed your mind because Daniel wanted to move. Daniel didn't want Denver more than I did. I know that now. The temptation to make it easier for her rose again. To say, it's okay. To erase the part she was struggling to name. I waited. Sophie continued. But you were right about something else. What? I still smiled. My throat tightened. She did not rush past it. I knew what they were doing to you. Even if I thought you had lied to me, I knew it was your wedding. I knew Mom was humiliating you. The room felt suddenly smaller. Sophie's voice dropped. And part of me was glad she was making you stay. There it was. Not the explanation. The responsibility. I'm sorry, she said. Not because Mom lied. I'm sorry because I wanted you cornered. For a while, I could not speak. A good apology does not repair the thing itself. It names it. That was new between us. I believe you're sorry, I said. Her breath caught slightly. But I'm not ready to act like it didn't happen. Another pause. Okay. New argument. No appeal to her diagnosis. No request that I understand how scared she had been. Just okay. That mattered more than immediate forgiveness would have. How are you with the transport service? I asked after a moment. I still hate it. Can you use it? Yes. Those are different. I know. Her voice had a faint edge of amusement now. Apparently I'm learning that too. When the call ended, Daniel looked over from the couch. You okay? Yeah. That word was not entirely accurate. Grief sat beside the relief. But neither one canceled the other. Better than I was. Dad called a week later. Not texted. Called. I was walking back from a site meeting, hard hat clipped to my bag, when his name appeared. Hi, Dad. Got a minute? About 5. He cleared his throat. I took Sophie to that specialist near First Hill. I heard. She told you? Yes. Parking is awful. I smiled. So I've heard. He went quiet. The city moved around me. A bus hissed at the curb. Someone rolled a bike past. Then Dad said, I didn't realize how much driving there was. The sentence irritated me before it touched me. You didn't have to realize. He was quiet. You just had to ask. Another pause. Longer. You're right. My steps slowed. Dad rarely said those words without adding something after them. This time he did not. Then, I should have done more. There were 100 possible answers. You should have. Where were you? Why was being tired enough for you but not for me? Why did you point at the door at my wedding? All of those questions still existed. His sentence did not erase them. Yes, I said. He inhaled. That's all? For now. Another quiet stretch. Then he said, fair enough. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. A small amount of accountability. That was enough to leave where it was. Mom remained different. Her messages became less frequent but more polished. She stopped asking me directly to move back. Instead, she sent old photographs. Thanksgiving at their house. Sophie and me as teenagers. Dad grilling in the backyard. Images of belonging, without the accompanying workload. I rarely answered. Then, 5 months after we moved, a package arrived. The return address belonged to my parents. It was flat and carefully wrapped. Daniel set it on the kitchen counter. You expecting something? No. I knew before opening it. Inside was a new print of the wedding portrait. Uncreased, uncut. Daniel and I smiling under the venue lights. The exact image Mom had torn in half. A note was tucked behind it. When you're ready to remember us the way we were. Love, Mom. I read the sentence twice. The way we were. Not the way she had behaved. Not what had happened. The way we were. As if memory itself were the problem. As if the only repair required was choosing the prettier version. Daniel stood across from me. What do you want to do with it? The question stayed where he put it. No suggestion. No anger. Mine to answer. The portrait went back into the packaging. I wrote a short note. I remember. That's why the boundary stays. No explanation followed. No evidence. No lecture. I mailed it back the next morning. Mom did not respond. 6 months after Denver, Saturday arrived with rain tapping softly against the apartment windows. The real dining table had finally come. Most of the boxes were gone. My new office badge hung beside the front door. Daniel was on the balcony trying to decide whether the weather was light rain or aggressive mist, a distinction I refused to take seriously. Coffee brewed behind me. The refrigerator calendar caught my eye. Old habit. For years, Saturdays had been the place everything got stuffed. Sophie appointment, pharmacy, Mom, insurance, pickup, reschedule, drive, call. The current Saturday had one word written inside it. Nothing. A year earlier, that word would have frightened me. Nothing to do meant I had forgotten something. Nothing scheduled meant someone would call. Nothing needed meant I had failed to anticipate a need. Now, the empty square looked almost luxurious. A storage box sat on the bottom shelf of the hall closet. I pulled it out and carried it to the table. Inside were wedding cards, spare ribbon, the copy of our vows, and 2 pieces of glossy photo paper. My wedding portrait. The original one. Mom had torn it through my face and Daniel's shoulder. For months, I had assumed I would eventually decide whether to repair it. Tape it from behind. Have it professionally restored. Throw it away. Instead, I turned both pieces over. On the back, I wrote the date of our wedding. Then one sentence. The last day I confused being indispensable with being loved. The pen stayed in my hand for a moment. That sentence was not entirely about Mom, or Dad, or Sophie. Part of it belonged to me. I had participated in the confusion because being indispensable had felt safer than asking whether I was loved when I had nothing to offer. Useful people always know why they are being called. Loved people have to trust they might be wanted even when they arrive empty-handed. That had been harder for me. The 2 halves went back into the box. New tape. No frame. No repair. Just evidence of a life I understood differently now. The lid closed. From the balcony, Daniel called, "Breakfast?" My eyes went once more to the calendar. Saturday. Nothing. Anywhere, I called back. My phone was still on the kitchen counter when I walked out to join him. For the first time in years, nobody was waiting for me to solve their day. And I didn't need to be needed to know where I belonged.